I'm pleased to introduce Peter Van Artwijk, co-founder and principal of Chromium, a brand strategy firm with offices in DC and San Francisco. Peter works with an organization's leadership to craft strategic branding initiatives to develop vibrant cultures and support durable brands. He also serves as chairman of Artwijk, a consultancy based in Fairfax, Virginia, providing communication services for carriers, tech firms, member organizations, and other business partners to the insurance industry. All that's to say, Peter's knowledgeable in many facets of brand, marketing, strategy, and innovation. Before I pass the baton, again, I remind you to use your Q&A function to ask any questions and give feedback. Thanks so much.
Hello, folks. Welcome to our little chat, and I'd like to also reiterate what Misha said. Please fire when ready with your questions, and we'll make sure we get to as many as we can. I'd like to welcome Tom Kane, who's a transformational strategist at King Carlton, also here in Northern Virginia. I've known Tom about 12 years now. This is a management consulting firm, coaching and advisory, mainly within the wealth management industry. But Tom spends a lot of time working with and at banks and related financial services entities. Tom, I'm a big fan of this Simon Sinek series, and here's one of his books, Start With Why. Just a great book. And I also saw, he has a lot of TED Talks as well. And I saw one recently in which he was talking about how important it is for people at companies, small and big companies, to be allowed to fail. Because there's this stigma attached to failure. And if you're not failing, he says, you're not innovating, you're not being creative. Everybody feels like your bosses and your peers that you can't fail in the corporate world. And so, I wonder, in the DC area here, we hear a lot of this phrase, mistakes were made, and it's this way of deflect, blame. A lot of times it's politicians saying this, or avoiding blame entirely. Mistakes were made. But I think you share the belief of Simon Sinek that mistakes can be a good thing. How does this relate to the traditional staid old bankers? How do they get to fail? I mean, obviously they're protecting our money. Is the main thing they're doing, I guess.
Banking is really in stark contrast to the tech industry. I mean, banking is uber conservative. I mean, think about what it's at the heart of it. You're borrowing money from people and lending it to other people. And you darn well better make sure you're going to get paid back on time. And so your whole mantra is really about controlling and managing risk. You take that and you throw regulation on top of that, and people regulators peering over your shoulders, and you really tend to spend more of your time trying to stay out of trouble than to push the innovation envelope. And so when you have a culture like that, it attracts a certain type of individual, and the individuals that are attracted to that culture tend to be the careful managers, the business stewards, but not the innovative leaders, not the guys and gals that can look around corners and make decisions about what's going to happen in the future, and that are willing to, push and bend that envelope. And then that starts to feed on itself, because they hire people with a like image. And what I found is a lot of times the bankers I'm working with, they're career bankers. They have no other idea or insight into any other culture other than that of banking. So don't get me wrong, mistakes in banking can be very detrimental. There's holes above the waterline and holes below the waterline, and we saw some of those below the waterline in waterline 2008 during the financial crises. But ultimately, it is ingrained in the culture of banking, conservatism, based on what they've been doing. Yet the industry is changing. It's becoming increasingly competitive, and so they're going to have to change that culture and that mindset if they're going to be able to compete going forward.
Well, speaking of competition, there's the big banks. I think we know some of those name brands that are all around the country. There's some upstart sort of internet banks like Ally, for example. But then there's a whole bunch of community banks, 7,000, I think you told me. These they're all over the place in probably every community. do these how did they compete? How did they become innovative? How can they stay creative? How do they get their heads out of the sand? I mean, these are not big institutions, many of them. I know that they're probably pretty locally grounded, just like a lot of work we've done with independent agents and brokers. They're in every community around the country. But yet they have a lot of challenges when it comes to innovation, don't they?
Oh yeah, tremendous challenges, and of course, one size doesn't fit all. And you hate to make generalizations, but you do see recurring themes throughout these institutions, these regional banks as well as the community banks that, like you said, are located in every town and burg throughout the country. I think maybe to understand the challenges that they face, understanding some of the global economic stuff that's going on at a macro level would be helpful. So, if you turn back the clock and you look at the year 2000, you look at the Fortune 500, iconic brands, titans of industry. You look at the companies that were in the Fortune 500 in 2000, and then you fast forward to 2015, and over half of those companies don't exist. I mean, the topple rate and the disruption rate with these, again, iconic brands, if you will, companies that have been around that we grew up with, is really amazing when you sit back and look at it. And it looks as though it's only going to increase. Kind of a good example of that is Netflix. Netflix and Blockbuster. If you're Blockbuster, you could have had the best Blockbuster store in the country, the best management, the best location, the best marketing, the best employees. But when that little red envelope showed up in the mailbox, wow, your whole world changed. And what's amazing is you didn't catch on and you didn't adjust quickly, you're going to be out of business. I just learned this recently. Netflix actually took themselves to Blockbuster and offered themselves for sale for $50 million in 2000. Blockbuster said no. They did, I think, $1.5 billion in revenue last year. So, I mean, that was a deal. And these guys weren't forward enough thinking to see that happening. But I think it really is incumbent upon all industries, but banking, because that's where we're spending our time in particular, to really understand the lessons of change and disruption that are happening out there. So if we turn back to, head in the sand banks, and we do see a lot of mindless myopia in bankers, we can give you an example of that. I mean, recently, in 2015, there was a survey done with 110 C-level executive bankers, C-level or directors, and they put a list of startup companies in front of them, and they asked them, how many of these are you aware of? Have you ever heard of them? What do they do? Do you know what they do? And amazingly, 85% of these guys had never even heard of or didn't know what Square was. Now, you have to be part of the Walking Dead not to know that. I mean, you've slid your card through the dongle on the tablet or on the iPhone, and instantly you hear the little noise on your phone, and you've got a really convenient electronic receipt right there. Very, very convenient. Yet, if you're a banker and you're in this merchant banking space, I mean, that's a space that you dominated and owned. And if you haven't even heard of these guys, how do you protect against them? The same survey talked about in the wealth management space Betterment, which is known as a robo-advisor, and there's a score of these. In fact, Vanguard just developed a robo-advisor. Schwab developed one. BlackRock, which is the largest money manager in the world, just purchased one. But 92% of the bankers didn't know who Betterment was. So there's some danger. There is really risk in not knowing what you don't know. And there are these startups that are out there that seemingly are hiding in plain sight, So, and then really defining what banking is for a lot of folks. I don't know about you, because in answering your last question about process and what banks can do, the first thing they need to do is hurry up. They need to get a sense of urgency. In his groundbreaking book, Future Shock, Alvin Toffler coined a bunch of phrases, one of them being information overload. But one of my favorites is accelerated thrust. Accelerated thrust. And that was his concept that things were just going to move much more quickly in the future, predominantly based on technology. And he didn't think that was going to be such a great thing. He anticipated it would create a lot of anxiety. He anticipated that governments and societies wouldn't be able to keep up with it. And we're really seeing that come true today, right? I mean, we got cyber terrorism, we got people getting hacked, identity theft. So his point was, I mean, and let me give you a good example of that. If you go back in time and you look at Abraham Lincoln and Julius Caesar, all right, two dudes, they lived 2,000 years apart on different continents. And while they may have had a lot of stuff in common,
they both wore funny hats, right?
They both wore funny hats, that's for sure. The one thing they had in common is they could go about 20 miles in a day on a horse. When Lincoln died, they put him on an iron horse, his body, and he was traveling about 20 miles an hour. In just a short 100 years after that, we were literally hurtling through space at over 20,000 miles an hour. So there's this compression in how quickly things are happening and coming at us today that is very important to understand. And I think often bankers are accustomed to doing things on their own time, on their own terms. And yet now I find that we're amid a consumer revolution, that nowhere in the history has the consumer gotten more of what they want more quickly, more customizable, and at a better price. I mean, Amazon's going to be delivering packages with drones. I heard Walmart's going to try to follow suit with that. Think about how you buy music now. So the consumer, keeping them at the forefront, as Steve Jobs did, is really going to drive a lot of this change. So in your last question, you hit the nail right on the head when you started to talk about process, because you really do need to have a process in place if you're going to transform, and that's what you need to do. It's no longer incremental change, in my opinion, around the edges, which is what so many folks are doing. It really is a full blast transformation. And so part of the thing you have to do is figure out who's going to try to block that transformation, because there are going to be those insidious traditionalists, I like to call them, who, I know how things are done. It's been done this way the whole time, and I know what works and doesn't work. Said the guy at Kodak, about digital photography. So I think we need to create processes. We have to have urgency, and then a process for innovation. And if you think of a big funnel, and at the top of the funnel is where the ideas are created, ideation, if you will. And you get those ideas, it's easier now than ever. You get those ideas from your customers and from your employees. And through the use of social media and some of the digital tools that are out there, that's so much easier than it was in the past. You take those ideas, you evaluate, you filter, you come up with the best ones, you fund and sponsor them, then you incubate and develop them. And that really is a recipe for transformation versus just managing or running a business. And I think, ideas are going to be the currency of the 21st century. And we need to treat them like assets, like hard assets. We need to protect them. Well, we need to acquire them, protect them, grow them, manage them, and ultimately monetize them. And so when we start to look at this innovation and these ideas as hard assets, like we would a piece of real estate, and treating them that way, I think banks and all industries are going to be in a better position going forward. So I think you have to have a process in place, and the tools out there now will allow that to happen. And then you have to create a culture that allows for innovation and allows mistakes to happen.
Right. So speaking of culture, there's these banks have these silos. A lot of organizations do. It's just probably a creation of baby boomers, or maybe even the senior generation before baby boomers. But they wanted everything structured, everything in its place. Everybody went to work, put your nose to the grindstone, do your job. If you're in the loan department, do your job. If you're doing the teller desk, do your job. Do your job. They have silos everywhere. And what I've been reading about cultures that are more effective, they have subject matter experts, of course. Insurance companies, for instance, have actuaries and underwriters. They got to have that discipline. But they also need to work together. The more innovative firms, which is probably 5 or 10% of them, I'm sure in banking it's similar, are doing things differently. How are they breaking down those silos? You spend a lot of time in wealth management. Wealth management is essentially largely a sales job versus service and management kind of job that traditional bankers. How do they even talk to each other? How do they even get anything done? How do they innovate?
Yeah, not well. They don't communicate very well, to be honest with you. Silos, man. If I heard that term one more time, it's been around for 20 years. Everybody talking about breaking down the silos and wealth management and integrating trust and brokerage and RIAs and all these different business lines focused on internal turf and products versus focusing on the client and the client experience. Because as you know, as a branding expert, Pete, you don't own the brand anymore as a company. This is all grassroots stuff. It used to be that we could push out the ads and tell people what to think, on the television or in a newspaper. But now it's all viral. And so our clients own our brands, they own the products and all of those types of things. The thing we can control is our interfaces with those clients and that client experience. So there are a lot of examples of incongruity in wealth management departments. I work with a bank that they owned an RIA, they owned an introducing broker dealer, they had two relationships with third party broker dealers and a huge trust department. And how they try to integrate and have a cohesive client experience was beyond me. I mean, they were just not successful at that. And so we had to go in and really help them with that integration. We recommended that they had one head of wealth management versus 5 people reporting into different leaders, and those types of strategies, as well as getting onto one system that could be used by all of these parties. We had them get rid of certain of those business lines, consolidate, collapse them in order to make them more agile, like some of the smaller upstarts that they're competing with. And with all that said, when we left, we had actually negotiated a really cool contract where all they had to do was move accounts off of one platform onto the new platform that they all endorsed. And guess what? 3 years later, they haven't moved those accounts. And it was multi-millions of dollars that they would get for moving those accounts. Because those traditionalists, those people, guardians of the budgets, as I like to call them, they're the guardians of the budget are not taking money and they're not putting it toward innovation and R&D. So another thing you have to do is you've got a budget for this stuff. You can't just continue to send the resources toward all of these failed and legacy systems and business lines and products and keep trying to prop them up. You think about Netflix again, and it really tells you about this accelerated thrust and what they had to do. So they're sitting on top of the world, man. They in 2007 they delivered their 1 billionth video. So they're on top of the world. They own it. They've knocked out their biggest competitor. Mom and pop video stores are gone. And what happened? Boom! Right around the corner, here's streaming. A whole new industry. We got Apple TV. We got Hulu. We got Roku. We've got this whole new industry. So you've got to keep running your old business while developing a new business. And even that didn't sit for very long. Think about it. Just 4 short years later, they came up with binge watching an original series in order to remain competitive and relevant in a really space that's getting much more crowded. So, in banks, you've got to run your existing business while constantly reinventing yourself as Netflix had to do. So
not easy, but we had a question about culture, Tom, from the audience about how do you encourage a culture in a bank? Remember, they're in the same boat many other industries are, with 93 million millennial workers coming into the workforce. How do they attract them, and how do they build a culture where these young people can come in and make some mistakes and shake some things up? I mean, what have you seen? What's working?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. It really is, and in fact, really relevant because I was having this conversation with a client just this morning about the importance. I'm designing a compensation plan for them, and they're so fearful that their financial advisor is going to go and take their clients at some point down the road. They're trying to put every bell and whistle and work everything into this compensation plan. And I shared with them that compensation is well down the list for reasons that advisors actually leave. It's management is number one, independence, and culture, really. The brand is very important. If you have a tarnished brand, that's going to cause people to leave. And so we talked about the importance of creating and instilling a really positive culture. sort of one way to do that is to, the first rule of holes. Stop doing what you're doing. We see so many of these guys beating a dead horse. They're going to just try to revive an old, tired, antiquated business model, which really doesn't inspire people. You go back to that audience looking at Steve Jobs, they were inspired. That's where they were cheering. They were cheering for that culture and that freedom that they had. So I think that's one thing. You have to have a sense of urgency because these people see the world around you moving. I like to take a page out of Tony Hsieh from Zappos playbook, which is one of the things I suggest. Create meaning, create purpose, create connection. He says that it's all about delivering happiness. But he's talking about delivering happiness to his employees before he's even thinking about the customer. In fact, he said culture is more important than the customer for making a great brand. So that's one thing, is you really have to focus and measure it. The fifth dragon king of Bhutan. Bhutan's a little country sandwiched between the two most populous countries in the world, India and China. And this guy took over the throne, I think he was like 17, and he's on his first world tour, and he's over in India, and some member of the press is hammering him about GDP. How are you going to improve the quality of life in GDP? And he thought for a minute, and he said, I'm more worried about GNP. GNH, I'm sorry. So what's GNH? Gross national happiness. And so Bhutan became the first country to measure how happy their people are. And by almost any survey, you find that it's one of the happiest countries to live in. And now 80 countries are going out and they're measuring it. So you got to keep your finger on the pulse of the culture, and you got to keep measuring, what you're doing, what's working, and what's not. That's certainly one way. Tony Hsieh calls it a holacracy. A holacracy. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I just read in the Wall Street Journal from Terry again today, where he talked about three kinds of cultures. The culture that's on paper, like the org chart. Number two is the one that people actually follow politically to get things done when they can't go to the boss or whatever. And then the third one is the one the company wants to be, aspires to be, the one that will get them the most growth. It's like an aspirational kind of org chart or culture. And so when he's talking about the holacracy, he was talking about the one in which you create the perfect one. Not the one on paper, not the one people de facto lean to, but the one that's going to really be the best for everybody. Guys, great.
Yeah, it's cutting edge stuff, and I think that banks are behind implementing those types of cultures. I mean, creating that kind of culture for people to thrive in. And a lot of times you say, "Oh, it's all the millennials, and blah blah blah. They're just spoiled, or this or that." But it's a reality. People are working differently. Technology has changed the way that people work, and the business culture is changing. So I think banks need to figure out how to create purpose and meaning and connection, those things that folks are looking for. Another way, you talked about silos. You know what Apple does, because they want to be client-centric. Under Steve Jobs, they have one P&L. It's Apple. That just, every time the first time I saw that, and every time I think about that, and I compare it and contrast it to banks, every department, which is really a product almost, revolves around a product or set of products, has its own P&L. And so people they're just looking out for their bottom line. That's how they get rewarded typically, versus having multidisciplinary groups of people that are nimble and agile, like small companies, like the startups they're competing against, working toward innovation and change. And so you talked about breaking silos down. Part of that is really from how people are incentivized. I have no incentive if I'm Bill, in one department, or Tom in one department, to step across the aisle and help Pete in another department. And in fact, I have disincentives for doing it, because you and I, Pete, we might both be trying to get the same next job. We're both trying to impress the brass. You're one of my peers, and my boss is saying, "Hey, you know what? Focus on your work, not Pete's work." But no, I really have a great idea that can advance Pete's business. No, that's not the way it's set up.
Right. Okay.
So.
Well, Tom, it looks like we're out of time. Really nice chat. I appreciate everybody listening to the conversation. We're going to be planning on some more of these in the future. I want to thank you, Tom, for your time. And the next one, hope to be able to do some case study work around how you were able to break down silos, especially with the wealth managers in those banks, because I think that's a really rich area for another coffee chat. But for now, thanks so much for being with us, Tom, and thank you to the audience as well.
Yeah, no, it's been fun. It's always good to see you, Pete, and it's I've enjoyed it. Do we have any questions, or how are we doing?
We're doing good on questions. Nisha?
Yeah, actually, we had a few questions come in. One of the questions I wanted to give to you guys that we've received from Robert Paul is, given the accelerated speed of business and availability of new technology, like person-to-person payments, what are the best opportunities and strategies for small, independent brick-and-mortar community banks? Local business lending, local cost-related savings programs. What type of internal cultural changes will have to take place for them to take advantage of these opportunities?
One thing we see getting a lot of traction is affinity marketing. We've heard for years about niche marketing, and banks are almost in a perfect position to leverage their existing expertise in certain fields. And whether that is with small business owners, and identifying, figuring out, say, in wealth management and across the financial services spectrum, what is it that small business owners want? And I think it's quite different than what a lot of people think, particularly in wealth management. Everybody's trying to get their assets, and most small businesses are reinvesting their assets into their own business. They're building equity in their business versus buying equity of somebody else's business. So it's helping them make their businesses better. Things like retirement benefits, employee benefits, and those types of things. Business valuation. If you're a business owner, you're always constantly wondering what it's worth. So if you can find a couple of niches or affinity markets that are deep enough to penetrate and become the expert in those, you'll absolutely win the day there. I've got a perfect. You talk about case studies or examples. So my brother's a firefighter, 34 years, Fairfax County, a retired battalion chief. They have a program they call it the DROP program, Deferred Retirement Option Plan. And what they do is they allow county workers to state that they're going to retire 3 years in advance. They continue to come to work, they continue to get paid, but they take 100% of their pension or their benefit and they put it in this deferred account. Okay? So all of a sudden, my brother has all this stuff going on in his life. Never had two nickels to rub together. Had 5 kids, sent him to college. He's retiring. His whole life is changing, and he has this big pot of money that he's going to get. He's get the deferred retirement plan as well as his 457 plan. So my wife's a financial advisor. Who does he go to for advice for that money? Not my wife. He goes to the guy that specializes in drop. And so do all the school teachers. And so this guy figured out that all these county executives are going to be in this situation at some point, and there's enough of them to make a living, and he's cornered the market. So that's just one thought, is to get really good in a niche.
Interesting. Let's see if we have another. We don't have any other questions. We hit 3 of the questions that we got. So again, Tom, thanks for your time very much, and we'll have you on another coffee chat. For now, cheers, buddy.
Yeah, cheers. Happy to do it. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.